Night shifts weren't supposed to feel like this. Claire had worked as a nurse for 9 years, mostly ER, sometimes urgent care. She'd seen broken bones, bad crashes, overdoses, the occasional late-night drama. But in early 2009, something changed. They started coming in different, not bleeding, not screaming, just quiet, middle-aged men with eyes too still, young women who wouldn't unclench their fists, seniors who should have been resting. Instead, they were swallowing pills alone. The triage charts began to blend. Overdose, self-inflicted laceration, attempted hanging. Claire documented, monitored vitals, made notes in boxes marked psych consult ordered. But what she saw didn't fit in any form. Because these weren't people escaping from trauma. These were people escaping math. "I lost everything," one man mumbled as she checked his blood pressure. She asked him to clarify. Retirement, house, dignity, pick one. His wrist was bandaged, his voice flat. Another patient, early 30s, still in a suit, kept asking if they would notify his employer. "We won't," she assured him. He cried harder. "Then no one will know it happened." Claire started noticing patterns. The wallets were always empty, phones left behind, shoes unlaced, documents folded in back pockets, foreclosure notices, bank letters, pink slips. One man had written his login credentials on his forearm in permanent marker. Not a suicide note, just access for someone to sort the wreckage. The staff began working in a hush. No jokes, no gossip, just the routine of stabilizing what didn't want to be saved. And Claire began to dread the 2 a.m. admissions, because they weren't just bodies, they were warnings. Most of them wouldn't stay long. Psych held them briefly, then discharged with a pamphlet and a follow-up date no one ever kept. Some came back, some didn't, and slowly Claire began to understand this wasn't random. It wasn't seasonal. It was a wave, a quiet epidemic wearing a suit and tie. And it had no interest in headlines, because what was happening was off record, unquantified, invisible, and growing. By March, Claire stopped pretending the cases were unrelated. She noticed it first in the wristbands. Names repeating. Birth dates close together. Addresses from the same neighborhoods. One night, she admitted a man in his late 50s. Tremors, shallow breathing, pill ingestion. He survived, barely. As she wheeled him to psych, she saw a familiar last name on the chart beside him. Same street, same house number, father and son, 2 weeks apart. The son hadn't made it. Claire excused herself in the supply room and stood there longer than necessary, staring at the shelves until her breathing slowed. She wasn't allowed to cry on the floor. Not officially. There was always another patient coming. And they kept coming. Construction workers, accountants, former managers who spoke in apology before they spoke in pain. "I'm not sick," one woman whispered as Claire placed the IV. "I just can't make the numbers work anymore." Claire nodded, because arguing felt cruel. The EO whiteboard filled faster now. Psych consults stacked, beds turned over like clockwork. The hospital administration sent emails about capacity strain and non-essential admissions. But none of this felt non-essential. These weren't accidents. They weren't impulsive. They were conclusions. People arriving after weeks, months, of trying to hold everything together quietly. Claire began to recognize the look, not panic. Not hysteria, relief. The relief of someone who had finally stopped running calculations in their head. One man asked her to hold his phone while she stitched his arm. "Can you delete my browser history?" He asked. "I don't want wife to see how long I was trying to fix it." She didn't answer. She just held the phone like it weighed 100 pounds. At shift change, nurses stopped asking, "What happened?" They asked, "Another one?" And the answer was always yes. More troubling was what happened after. Most were stabilized, evaluated, and discharged within 48 hours, told to follow up. Given hotline numbers printed on thin paper that tore easily. The system was designed to keep them alive, not to keep them whole. Claire watched them leave through the sliding doors, shoulders hunched, eyes empty, dignity held together with gauze and paperwork. She started keeping mental count, not for records, for mourning, because the wristbands kept repeating. And with each repetition, it became clearer. The crash hadn't ended. It had just moved indoors. He came in on a Thursday morning, after a graveyard shift that left Claire raw and running on adrenaline. Late 40s, clean clothes. No visible wounds, but something in his posture said collapse. The intake note was vague. Self-reporting ideation. No physical injury. He sat in the psych-eval room, hands folded like he was at confession. Claire checked his vitals, ran the basic questions. Have you harmed yourself? No. Do you have a plan to? No. Why are you here? He looked up. For once, I didn't want to be alone with the math. Claire paused. He went on, voice level but distant, like he'd said it 100 times in his head already. I had savings, a decent job, married 20 years, 2 kids in college. Then the bottom dropped out. We lost the contracts. They shut down my division. My 401k went with it. I stayed quiet. Told my wife we'd figure it out. He looked down. We didn't. Claire said nothing, just listened. I sold the second car, canceled everything but electricity and water. I begged the mortgage lender for a delay. They gave me one, then changed the terms, then sold the debt. He smiled, not kindly. And now, I owe a stranger the rights to my own roof. He clenched his hands. Everyone says it's temporary, a correction. But I live in a spreadsheet now. 1 column short. Claire wanted to ask more, but the room was already full of truth. He rubbed his temples. My son asked me last night why I don't sleep anymore. I told him I have a lot on my mind. He said, Dad, if we're poor now, does that mean we're bad? Claire felt something tighten in her chest. The man looked up again. That's when I knew I had to come here. Because I almost told him yes. She checked his chart later. No prior hospitalizations, no psychiatric history, clean record, good insurance. He was a perfect candidate for being ignored. Discharge was scheduled for 48 hours later. Standard. He left quietly. 2 weeks later, she saw his name again. Not as a patient. As a next of kin contact for someone else. A woman who had overdosed in the same neighborhood. His wife. The emergency contact form had the same address, same last name. Claire didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. Because one patient had finally spoken. And the story wasn't unique. It was just finally heard. The headlines said the market was recovering, that unemployment had peaked, that growth was returning, slowly but surely. Claire never believed a word of it, because recovery didn't come through her A doors. What came through were the faces behind the statistics. The man who couldn't pay rent after 30 years of work. The mother who stopped eating so her kids wouldn't go hungry. The teenager whose college dream died with their parents' retirement fund. None of them made it into charts. None of them were in the recovery index. But Claire saw them, touched their foreheads, checked their vitals, heard the last words they never meant to speak aloud, and she carried them. Long after the shift ended, long after the chart was closed, long after the public had moved on. While news anchors debated policy, she mopped blood off tile. While politicians talked about rebuilding, she wrapped trembling hands in warm blankets. She wasn't a policymaker. She didn't run a nonprofit. She wasn't even allowed to say what she knew publicly. But in the dark hours between 2 and 4 a.m., she became something more than a nurse. She became the memory keeper of all the ones who didn't survive the spreadsheet. And no matter what the next crash brings or how loud the silence gets, she will never unsee what was buried in the margins.